now too. Should I start over or just keep going? All right. So a lot of static analyses for parallel and concurrent programs, like those that detect deadlocks or race conditions, perform a lot of this analysis not over the source code of the program itself, but over an abstraction of the parallel structure of the code, which is variously known as a dependency graph, computation graph, or particularly when the property of interest is complexity, cost graph. So nodes in these graphs represent sequential pieces of computation, and edges represent dependencies. So much like the graphs from the previous talk, although we're interested in slightly different kinds of dependencies, not just communication. So in this abstract representation, many properties of interest become fairly straightforward, visible from the graph. So for example, as in the previous talk, a cycle in the graph represents a deadlock. And if there is no path between two nodes in the graph, then the two program points corresponding to those nodes may happen in parallel. So this could be useful, for example, in detecting a data race. In many modern languages, though, the parallel structure of the program is determined dynamically based on runtime information, which makes it quite difficult to statically predict anything about the graph. So for example, in the classic parallel Fibonacci function, the two recursive calls to fib are performed in parallel using this par construct, which returns a pair of the two results. But of course, the number of times the computation splits like this is determined by the argument to the function. So the graph structure is shown on the side. And because these graphs are hard to draw every time you want to use them, we'll use shorthands, notational shorthands. So we'll represent just a purely sequential computation with just this bullet and the parallel composition of two graphs using this tensor. So this is what's called a fork join program, where we have only sequential and parallel composition. But later on, I'll talk about futures, which allow much more complex dependency structures and much more complex graphs. So because these graphs can get so complex, the analyses to determine these graphs are similarly complex and must over-approximate the set of graphs that may result from running a program in order to maintain soundness. And furthermore, in the state of the art, the analyses to build these graphs effectively are built from scratch for every new analysis algorithm, whether it's a deadlock detector, a race detector, or cut off behind me down there, an analysis to determine the cost, the complexity of running a piece of code, so on. However, the dependency information that these analyses collect are fairly similar, regardless of what the actual analysis is. So in this paper, I present a framework to reason about the set of graphs that may result from running a program, allowing us to analyze a program once and get the graph information, and then use that graph information to do many different static analyses. And so this information is collected in a form that I call a graph type. I call it a graph type by analogy to the way that a static type gives a compact approximation of the set of values that might result from running a program. Similarly, a graph type is a compact approximation of the set of graphs that might result from running a program. So in general static typing, if we say that in a context where n has type int, fib of n has type int, then type soundness ensures that if we run this program, it indeed produces an int. Similarly, if we predict that fib of n will produce a graph type, which we labeled G, the soundness of the graph type system will indicate that big G is in fact an approximation that represents a set of graphs that includes the graph that actually reflects what happens during the execution of the program. So the paper first describes the syntax of graph types through several examples. Next, it presents a graph type system for a parallel calculus containing futures, as well as a proof of the soundness theorem that I motivated just a second ago on the previous slide. Then describes an inference algorithm for inferring graph types for a parallel functional program building on Hindley-Milner type inference. The algorithm has been implemented for a large subset of OCaml. The implementation was tested on a number of micro benchmarks, as well as a larger case study of a concurrent web server, and also includes proof of concept implementations of several different program analyses and transformations that we can do over graph types. So because of the time limitation in this talk, I'll primarily give an overview of graph types, as well as the graph type system used to assign graphs types to expressions, and some of the results proven in the paper. And I'll do all of this in the context of purely fork-join programs, like the Fibonacci example earlier. I will then discuss future work, by which I mean give a high-level overview of the work the paper does to handle futures, which is where most of the technical challenges are. Briefly, I'll then talk about the implementation and evaluation, and I'll conclude with some future work. To see graph types in action, let's go back to this Fibonacci example from earlier. Step through it to see how the parallel structure unfolds. So the body of the function itself is an if, which indicates that we're going to diverge and have two separate graph types depending on which branch we take. The if branch has no parallelism, so we represent that as a singleton graph, just a single node with no parallelism. And as before, we'll represent that with this bullet. In the else branch, though, we spawn two threads, which then will eventually join back together. And in the middle, they do what? Well, they each recursively call Fibonacci. So the graph structure that we should put in those two gaps is essentially a recursive iteration of the entire graph type itself. So we'll represent that using notation taken from recursive types. So the mu indicates that this is a recursive type. It binds gamma, which will stand for a recursive instance of the graph type. And then we have two instances of gamma composed together in parallel with the tensor notation that we used before. And that is the graph type for the Fibonacci program. So as I've said, graph type represents a set of actual graphs that might arise at runtime. Now we can recover the set of graphs through a process called normalization. If a graph type has recursion, the set of graphs is going to be infinite. So to avoid dealing with infinite sets, we parameterize the normalization operator by a natural number, which roughly corresponds to how many times we're going to unroll recursive graph types. So norm sub 1 of the graph type for the Fibonacci program is just the singleton graph. We unroll nothing, and so we get only sequential computation. Note that this is exactly the graph that we get from before when we run the Fib program on an input of 1. So for norm sub 2, we unroll the recursion, and now we have two possible cases. The first simply yields the singleton graph as before. And the second yields two recursive instances of gfib. So since we've already unrolled one recursion, we don't unroll any further. We decrement this index. And so each of these just bottoms out to the singleton graph, which we then compose in parallel. So now we are left with two graphs, the singleton graph and two singleton graphs composed in parallel, which are exactly the two graphs that you can get from running fib on 1 or 2. And we can continue going like this. So I motivated graph types using the Fibonacci program as an example. This also demonstrates most of what you need to know about deriving graph types for fork-join programs. So I'm just going to briefly go a little bit more formally into the type system. The judgment has two contexts. Gamma is the standard one, mapping variables to types. And delta gives the set of graph variables gamma, little gamma, which are in scope. In addition to a type, the judgment also produces a graph type G, corresponding to the graphs that evaluating the expression might produce. So the most interesting rule is the one for recursive functions. So note that the types of functions are annotated with the graph type that you might get by our graph type representing the graphs that you might get from applying the function. So this is much like in type and effect systems, where we annotate the effect, in this case the graph, of the function above the arrow. The graph type of declaring the function itself is, in fact, the singleton graph, because declaring a function does no computation and therefore has no graph. So just as with the Fibonacci example, we will infer a recursive graph type. We'll then need to add f, the function itself, to the context when we analyze the scope of the body, because it's a recursive function. And we need to give it a graph type above the arrow. So because instances of f inside the body will correspond to recursive calls, instances of f being called will correspond to instances of the recursive instances of the graph type itself. So the graph type that we will give f is little gamma. And the graph type of the body of the function then becomes the body of the recursive graph type that we derive for the function itself. So the rule for par then is basically what you'd expect. We derive two graph types for the two sub-expressions, and we compose them in parallel. So now that I've gone through all of that, I can formally state the soundness theorem that I've been motivating throughout the talk, which says that if the graph type system derives a graph type G for an expression E, and we then evaluate E, and it produces a graph G, then the graph that results, G, is in the normalization of big G, the graph type, for some natural number. So that was a broad overview of the arc of the paper. We defined graph types, we defined the normalization operator, defined a graph type system for a core language, and prove soundness. And as you saw for fork-join programs, it's relatively straightforward. But it gets much more complex when we add futures to the mix. So futures, also called promises in some languages, are much more powerful concurrency mechanisms or parallel mechanisms than fork-join. So a future is an asynchronous thread, which will spawn with the keyword future. And we have a handle to the future, which in this case we bind to fut1. So we can do some other stuff in the main thread. So here the future does stuff 1, we do stuff 2 in the main thread. And then we can synchronize back with the future by touching its handle using the keyword touch. But the key thing with futures is that we can also pass around the handle, including to other futures like we do here. And that's where the main power of futures comes in. So if u prime is this new future that we spawn at the bottom here, where do we add this edge, indicating that we now synchronize back with stuff 1? Well, it's not clear, locally at least, where to add this edge. So we need to know the actual graph in the actual vertex in the graph that ends this stuff 1 future so that we can add an edge. So to make this possible, we'll designate a last vertex for each future. We'll give it a name like u, and we'll add it as an annotation to both the future keyword and the type of the future. So now when we touch fut1, fut1's type will actually indicate that u is the last vertex of that future, and so locally now we know to add an edge from u to u prime. So in the more compact notation, this is how we'll denote a future whose last vertex is u that does stuff indicated by the graph S1, the graph type S1. This is how we'll denote a touch of the vertex u, which of course occurs itself in a future which has last vertex u prime. And in between, we do S2, composed with this sequential composition, which is that O+ notation. In the paper, we go into a lot of detail on the algorithm for inferring these vertex annotations. I don't have time to go through it here, so I'll just note that all of these u and u prime annotations are inferred by the type checker and not inserted by the programmer. So futures are first-class values, so they can, of course, be arguments to functions. And we'll see that that causes quite a bit of trouble. So here's a function, myTouch, that takes a future and touches it. So we can then spawn a future and call this function on it. But what should the type of the future be? So it'll take futures of some type, and it'll return something of that type. And the graph type over the arrow should indicate that the function touches that future. But of course, we want to be able to reuse this function on a different future. So the type of the function needs to be parameterized over the vertex of the future, and we'll do that using this pi construct. In the expression syntax, we'll bind a variable in brackets after the fun keyword. Once again, this isn't present in the actual source code written by programmers. It's inferred. So now an example that really shows the power of futures, and also the biggest challenge in adding them to the system. So this pipeline function takes a function f and applies it to every element of the list L, and then sums the results, kind of like a MapReduce. But it pipelines the maps and additions. So don't worry too much about exactly how this is implemented, but the important thing is that each recursive instance of pipeline takes a future that's computing the sum so far. So this would be the accumulator in a tail recursive implementation, but it's much more parallel than your normal accumulator because the accumulator is actually still being computed in parallel because it's a future. So as we saw on the last slide, the vertex of this future needs to be a parameter to the pipeline function. And let's say that the initial future passed in has vertex u0. So at each iteration, we spawn a new future u prime, which computes f, touches the accumulator to get the sum so far, and then adds the results. And you can see that the calls to f do occur in parallel in the graph, so we are successfully doing some pipelining. This new future becomes the next accumulator, and so it gets passed in when we recursively call pipeline. So at that point, we spawn another future, compute f, and now we want, oops. Right, so now we want to touch u prime, but there's a problem because there are two vertices labeled u prime. And we don't know which one to touch. So this means that vertex names must be used at most once, which in turn means that the part of the type system that deals with vertex names must be affine. It also means that in recursive functions, we'll need a way to generate new vertex names at runtime, which we'll do with this keyword new u prime. So now each time we expand the graph, we'll actually generate a new fresh vertex name. And so when we hit u3, we know that the vertex we're going to be touching is u2. So here's the full syntax for graph types with the composition and recursion operators we discussed before, as well as the new addition for futures. Syntax to bind a new vertex. So this is the graph type analogy of that new u prime syntax we just saw in the last slide. Also analogous to how functions are parameterized over vertices, graph types are also parameterized over sets of vertices that might appear in the graph type. There are actually two sets of vertices, so for reasons that hopefully will become clear on the next slide, we separate out the vertices that the graph might use to spawn futures from the vertices that it might touch. And of course, at various points, we'll need to instantiate those parameters in a graph type, and that's the last construct there. The full judgment for the graph type system, including futures, is much the same as before, but there are two new contexts for holding vertex names. So omega is the vertices that E might use to spawn futures, and that has to be affine for all the reasons we've seen. On the other hand, psi contains vertices that E might just use to touch futures, and that needs to be unrestricted because we do want to be able to touch a vertex more than once. So that's all I have time to say about the theory. I want to quickly note that there are many analogies here to region-type systems, which are used as a memory management system, for example, in the ML-kit implementation of standard ML. So in systems like this, allocations happen in regions, and you deallocate a whole region at a time. So in the calculi for these type systems, allocations are annotated with regions, much like how we annotate futures with vertices. The let region construct generates new regions at runtime, sort of like how we define new vertices at runtime. And there's an inference algorithm for inferring these region annotations, which inspired this paper's algorithm for inferring vertex annotations. But of course, there's something new here. The main difference between these two types of systems is that futures need to have unique vertices, which of course has huge implications on the theory and the inference algorithm. Whereas regions can be reused, and indeed you want to have multiple allocations mapped to the same region because otherwise a region only containing one allocation isn't very useful. So the graph type inference, including inferring the vertex annotations, is implemented for a decent sized subset of OCaml in a tool that I call GML. So the input code is valid OCaml code with no extra annotations, just extra syntax for spawning and touching futures. So it'll infer all of these annotations and produce a graph type from your program and spit it out, but that's just in ASCII representation, which is not very useful. So then there are a few things you can do with it. So we can visualize the graph type in a nice graph visualization. We have prototype implementations of a deadlock detector, complexity analysis, and I don't really have time to talk about the fork join transformation, but see the paper. You may also, of course, after you're done with all of this, want to compile your code, but we leave that for the OCaml compiler, so that's not part of this tool. So just the visualization itself is pretty useful for debugging. So for example, if we take this pipeline program from earlier, remember the calls to F are happening in parallel. By the way, this visualization is actually the one produced by the tool, so vertex names are a little bit different. But now let's just swap these two add-ins. So because we touched the old future before we call f, actually we've now sequentialized all the calls to f. And it's not obvious from the code, but it's fairly obvious from the visualization of the graph. A few other empirical results. Graph type inference scales pretty well, so it can be included as just a normal step in compilation. The deadlock detector correctly finds deadlocks in several adversarial examples and marks several deadlock-free examples as deadlock-free, including one that wouldn't be marked as such by prior work on deadlock detection, and correctly identifies the asymptotic complexity of several parallel algorithms. So in terms of future work, there's lots to be done in expanding the expressiveness of graph types. So for example, recursive data structures that include futures. We need to be able to generate new future vertex names for each future in, say, a list. So we need like a type level new. And of course, I've developed prototype static analyses for deadlock detection and race detection and so on. But these are based on some heuristics and not very well engineered. And so it would be nice to really develop well-founded, well-engineered, provable static analyses based on graph types. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, cool stuff. Questions? Right.
Thanks for the talk. This is great. Gilbert here. So I have a somewhat naive question. Hopefully not too naive. So these dependency graphs show up in all sorts of cases, also in compilers for reordering, scheduling code. And personally, I've had a ton of trouble finding a really clear definition of what these dependency graphs are in terms of an underlying language semantics. Are you aware of any canonical reference for that, or do they end up meaning slightly different things in slightly different circumstances?
So this seems related to a question that I was trying to answer when I was going through this work. I wasn't really able to find a canonical definition or reference for this kind of thing. And if anybody is aware of one, I'd like to hear about it too. But really, there are many different kinds of dependency graphs. So like you talked about, even in sequential programs, you can have dependency graphs. So this is relevant in program slicing. It's come up in many different contexts in program analysis. So I'm using it to mean one particular thing in terms of a parallel structure of programs forking and joining back together. But there are many different places where this kind of thing comes up, and I don't know that there's really great underlying unifying things. Yeah.
Okay, one more question.
So I'm interested in graph rewrites, and I'm thinking about how during program optimization, you may choose to rewrite your program in certain ways. Have you looked into how, say, simple term rewriting affects the graph type of that term?
I haven't looked into it, but that would be something really interesting. So I've looked into a bit of, I don't know how related this is, but that the fork join transformation that I briefly mentioned uses the graph to guide program optimizations. So it looks for places in the graph where you can apply an optimization and rewrite the program. And then so you know kind of ahead of time what effect that's going to have on the graph. But going the other way is interesting too. I haven't really thought about it.
Okay, we're running over a bit, so let's take further questions offline. Thank you.